All right. Well, in the interest of time, I wanted to welcome everybody today to the ESG Controller. This is a masterclass with Professor Todd Court, as well as our alumni panel. My name is Keith Gallinelli. I'm the Director of Admissions here at the MBA for Executives program. We have a number of people. We have some prospective students joining us. I know we also have some alumni from Yale, Yale as a whole, and Yale SOM. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to start off with just a very brief overview of the MBA for Executives program, and then I'm going to turn it over to Professor Court, and we're going to get right into our master class for ESG. Just one thing to know, I'm going to be a very kind of brief when I talk about the program as a whole. We have a number of additional presentations that we go over the program. We have on-campus events. So there's a lot of ways to interact with us in the program. At the end, we will also talk about some next steps for our prospective students, and then have a Q&A session for our professor and our panelists as well. So as we get started, we're right now I'm sitting here in beautiful Evans Hall, which is the home of the School of Management. It's a very beautiful building. And there's, when people think of Yale, they think of the history of Yale, 300 years of history, a lot of presidents and political leaders, Supreme Court justices, people have come through these halls. But everyone really comes in with the idea, especially to the School of Management, with our mission in mind. And our mission is to educate leaders for business and society. I think this is really important for people that want to be a leader that makes a difference, people that might make a difference in the public sector, in the private sector, bringing really together the best of ideas from a variety of industries and regions. Our faculty, our alumni, our students, everybody really buys into this mission, this broader idea of contributing to high-functioning organizations and the broader well-being of society. And I think that really goes into what we're talking about with ESG and our sustainability area of focus. And we're going to get into that in just a minute. So briefly about the MBA for Executives program. It is an on-campus program, and it starts off every year in July with a 2-week residency, and then we'll continue on for 22 months. It's a pretty intense program. It kicks off with these residency weeks, and then it goes to an every other Friday, Saturday format. In between years 1 and 2, you have an opportunity to expand your global network and go on a global network week experience, coming back for a week of residency, and then back to that every other weekend format. So for our alumni, you have recently gone through this. I'm sure it's a challenging program, but it's also very rewarding at the same time. The curriculum as a whole, just to kind of give you a broader an understanding of it, in year 1, what we do is very similar to our full-time program. We have what's called our integrated core. And these are classes that are organized around stakeholder perspectives, not just narrow functional disciplines. So you might be taking a class in something called the customer, the competitor, the workforce, state and society, sourcing and managing funds. These are perspectives that are going to be across multiple disciplines and multiple industries. And so this is in year 1, really to build up people's business skills. In between those 2 years, we have our Global Network Week, where you can have the opportunity to do a very intense study at one of our Global Network for Advanced Management partner schools around the globe. And then you come back into year 2, and this is where you can take a deep dive into one of our areas of focus, as well as into our advanced management courses. And so we have these 3 areas of focus in asset management, healthcare, and sustainability. And so today's talk is going to be really focused on sustainability. And so what I wanted to do is just to provide a little bit of a context for everyone. When you are in these area of focus classes, there are a number of courses that you have as electives. For people that choose to take a deep dive into one of our areas of focus, you have to take at least 4 of them. You could take all 6 if you would like, but you also have the ability to take some classes from some of our other areas as well. And today we're going to be focusing on the ESG Controller. And so with that, I wanted to make sure I went through this relatively quickly, but I'm going to turn this over to Professor Court. He is a senior lecturer here in sustainability. He is also the faculty director for our sustainability area of focus. He has an appointment both in the School of Management and in the School of Environment, and is the faculty co-director for the Yale Center for Business and the Environment. So Professor Court, I'm going to turn that over to you. I'm also going to share with you our alumni guests. So if everybody wants to introduce themselves, and I'll let you take it away from there.
Thank you, Keith. And Keith, you'll also keep us honest on time, I assume, because we can. I know Cece and Christina well, so we could go on and on for days and days. So make sure that we behave ourselves.
Definitely. And also too, I forgot to mention, if you do have questions along the way, please put them into the Q&A portion of the webinar. We will definitely get to them at the end, but if there are some things that we can answer via text, we'll do that as well. So.
All right, my quick introduction, then I'm going to hand to Christina and Cece to introduce themselves as well. As Keith says, I'm a professor here at the School of Management. I teach the executive MBAs, and I'm also the faculty director for the sustainability program. The class that I teach now to the executive MBAs is the ESG Controller class. So we'll build off a little bit of the topics in that course or in that classroom. Today we're joined by two of our alums, two that I'm privileged enough to have been around when they went through our program. So first I'll hand over to Christina. Christina, do you mind doing a quick introduction?
Not at all. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to see you guys. My name is Christina Wyatt. I'm the Chief Sustainability Officer and Deputy General Counsel at a software company called Persephone. We are a carbon accounting, carbon management SaaS software company. My background is as a lawyer. I was a corporate and securities lawyer for many years and then started to pivot into sustainability. I was working in the law firm of Latham & Watkins, and I kind of cajoled them into letting me start a sustainability program and ultimately an integrated sustainability practice at Latham. And during that time, I also cajoled them into letting me come to Yale and get my MBA, which was an amazing experience, as we'll talk about, and you'll get a sense for that. And got my MBA in 2020, and then shortly after President Biden was elected, I was asked to go over to the SEC to work on the climate disclosure rule that has now been adopted, and then came to Persephone, this carbon accounting software company, all because I was sort of trying to chase purpose and impact. And so going to the SEC was a way to apply what I had learned at Yale and at Latham to the problem that I thought was most urgent that I could have an impact on at the time. And then having sort of written the rules, it occurred to me that the greatest impact that I could have was through a software company that helps companies to report. So that's me.
Excellent. I'm sure we'll dive into more of everybody's experience as we go. But Cece, do you want to give a quick introduction?
Great, thanks. And thanks for having me here. I'm Cecilia Shutters. I'm based out of the New York City office. I'm the head of sustainability for Revlon, the beauty and personal care company. You may be familiar with the brand. I've been with the company for about 1.5 years, and in fact, made the transition to the private sector just after graduating in 2022 from the EMBA program, or I should say with the, sort of with the help and knowledge that I gained maybe from the program. Prior to that, I had spent 12 years in nonprofit across sustainability implementation topics, from green building to recycling. And I have a master's in energy policy. And so that's where I sort of started, was thinking about the built environment and public policy, and how, that relationship, how that relationship works. And much like Christina, started, kind of with that lens, and then through that work realized I really wanted to be able to speak the language of business, so that these solutions that I am compelled to help drive forward can move faster, when you've got the vocabulary that spans the public, the private, and the academic sectors. So I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. Thanks, Todd.
Well, thank you both for joining us. Both Christina and Cecilia, they're really relevant to this conversation. So I'm going to give a little bit of background, but the basics here are we have two worlds colliding today. We have this raft of regulations that is coming down from different jurisdictions around the world in different formats, asking for different things, but all in this area of sustainability and ESG disclosure. I recognize several people on the screen, but I know that not everyone might know the acronym, so I'll try to be a little careful. So when I say ESG, I'm talking about environmental, social, governance factors. You can go back to the regulations, Keith. So we have this one world of regulation coming in around disclosure requirements. And then we've got this other world, the world of Cecilia, of sustainability disclosures that have been going on for decades now, 30 plus years of disclosing information around sustainability performance, environmental, social, governance performance. So today we're really in this unique space where those people who know sustainability have been talking about sustainability performance and risk, the controlling and the governance and the management structures around those risks and opportunities. They are now working under the auspices of these different regulations. And it's given rise to this unique role that we're calling, or is being called, the ESG Controller. That's what we want to talk about today. So just to set the stage really, really quickly, there's a number of regulations coming down the pipe for companies. I've just listed 3 of them just for kind of stage setting purposes, but there are more. So in the very center, many of you will be familiar with the European Union has a rule out now called the CSRD, or Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. We'll likely touch on that a fair amount. But in essence, the EU has required now companies that have significant operations and revenue derived in the European Union, you now have to report against a set of standards, the ESRS standards, around what are considered to be material, environmental, social, governance factors. And material, we're going to talk about in just a little bit, is defined in a very particular way. Here in the United States, we've got a couple of other rules that are relevant. Christina mentioned the Securities and Exchange Commission. It now has a climate rule out that is it's being litigated, but is nevertheless present. And that speaks to both climate emissions as well as financial risks from climate change. And California has similar rules out, 253 and 261, again, speak to climate emissions and climate risk. And now we have fairly recently 219, which is an amendment to those rules to try and clarify them. There are rules around the world now around what companies do and don't have to disclose in terms of regulated ESG disclosures. But these are just some of the samples, and maybe a few of the ones that we can dive into a little bit more deeply. So the next slide. What do you have to talk about? Very basically, and I'm sure that most people on the line know this, very basically, all these rules require some process of materiality determination. So I've put up a couple of examples of double materiality. This is specific to the EU CSRD. Double materiality refers to, I have to think about ESG issues along along 2 different axes. One axis is, does that environmental or social risk pose a material financial risk to my company? I.e., it's from outside to inside. Does that externality create an internalized risk to the finances of my company? At the same time, the CSRD requires that I think about what are the risks that I create to environment and society as a result of my business operations and activities. That is an inside-out looking risk, and what we usually refer to as an impact assessment. What kind of an impact do I create on the environment? Do I create lots of greenhouse gas emissions? Do I degrade ecosystems significantly? Do I create large amounts of socioeconomic inequality or human rights impacts, for example? So that inside out and outside in lens is a requirement of the CSRD under the double materiality standard. And on the right, you see just an example from that I pulled off the web. There are dozens of examples now of a double materiality. And the EU requires that if something is high on either the impact or the financial axes, that I would then disclose on that into my CSRD report. And I'm going very quickly, so I'm sure everyone has specific questions, but we'll dive into this. Next slide, please. So at the same time that these regulations are expanding, we're also seeing this consolidation around disclosure standards. This is just a snapshot that I pulled from Bloomberg around one particular coalescing. Those of you who have tracked disclosure standards over the years, you'll know that we've had substantial consolidation from what was, a high number of disclosure standards, like the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, or SASB, the International Integrated Reporting Council, which used to be the IIRC and then became very Prince-like into a brackets IR, and you can pronounce that however you like. That became their Value Reporting Foundation, which then was consolidated under the International Sustainability Standards Board, the ISSB. Then we've got the GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative, which is now integrated into the ISSB, but not under the auspices of the ISSB. The Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, the TCFD, is now under the auspices of the ISSB. And the Carbon Disclosure Project, which became the CDP because they did more than just carbon, launched the Climate Disclosure Standards Board, which is also now under the ISSB. So this huge consolidation into the International Sustainability Standards Board. And that ISSB is issuing a set of standards called the IFRS standards. There's two published right now, one on general disclosures and one on climate. So we've seen this consolidation of the major standards, but not perfect consolidation. There's still the greenhouse gas protocol is still a separate entity, but referenced throughout these standards. The principles for responsible investing, it's still a separate standard, but referenced throughout. And then there are hundreds of other standards that are sitting around the periphery with very, very specific applications and very, very specific markets. So it's coalescing, but it's still very, very confusing. So the last slide, to just as a level setter here, is all of this new regulation, the consolidation of standards. It's led to companies investing in this role that, for lack of a better term, we're calling an ESG controller. I did a quick AI, said, what is the role of an ESG controller? This is what comes out. It's actually pretty accurate. These people, they're responsible for developing the reporting frameworks that the company is going to report against, responsible for managing or at least understanding where the data is going to come from to report against the indicators that are identified, ideally implementing best practices to improve performance and disclosure practices across the company, certainly analyzing the data, collaborating with stakeholders, and then tracking and preparing all that data. And to add on to this, which AI did not catch very well, is this is the person that needs to understand the financial implications of that ESG and sustainability data and to communicate that under the new disclosure regulations. So these ESG controllers have a lot of responsibility, and they're very, very new in terms of what they have to understand. We haven't seen the likes of this ESG controller in the past. The closest we've had is an enterprise risk management person or controller that thought about kind of SOX or Sarbanes-Oxley type risks. That hasn't been a very specific role until today, where we've had these regulations rolling out. So that's a little bit of the framing. It's a really interesting time in the sustainability disclosure world. Just wanted to set the stage a little bit. I want to spend the bulk of our time talking to Christina and Cecilia. Let me start with Christina. And Christina and I do this a lot, and she's always very tolerant of my weird questions. So I want to start with just a framing question, Christina. You've seen those charts before of the consolidation. You know all the regulations that are coming out. Can you kind of give me your observations on the evolution of disclosure and the rising role of this ESG controller? Like, what are you seeing in the space?
Sure. Well, it's interesting. We actually, when I was at Yale, we worked together on a couple of projects that really examined the problem with the reporting landscape at the time. And this was really just a few years ago. But the problem was that you had hundreds of different reporting frameworks, which all impose some kind of different voluntary reporting standards. People would call it the alphabet soup of ESG reporting standards. And we discussed and actually published a paper, and my capstone project during my MBA program was a pretty long paper that turned into a chapter in a securities law book that examined the history of these different reporting frameworks and kind of came to the conclusion that we needed to have consolidation, that the fragmentation wasn't helpful. And so when I went to the SEC, and this was largely why I went to the SEC, was to work on trying to pull together these various different fragmented voluntary frameworks into a better harmonized regulatory reporting regime. And so the SEC rule came out, the proposal came out in 2022, the final rule in early 2024. When we were working on the proposal, we sort of talked to a lot of stakeholders, including, importantly, corporations, investors, and a whole variety of different stakeholders, and asked them, what's the problem with the system? What would you like to see? And consistently we heard, we want to see a harmonized reporting environment. We don't want to have lots of different standards to report to because it's burdensome and it's unhelpful and it exposes us to unnecessary risk. So we're trying to figure out, what was the common lane of travel, came to the greenhouse gas protocol and the TCFD, which you mentioned. So greenhouse gas protocol for measuring your carbon emissions, TCFD, Task Force on Climate Related Financial Disclosures, for assessing and managing your climate related financial risk, and built rules around those two frameworks. And at the same time, we were working with the IFRS Foundation, which was sort of the big, on your slide, it was the kind of centralized standard setter that ended up rolling up the SASB and GRI and TCFD and CDSB and all the, the central alphabet soup players. And as they were developing the ISSB and building their standards, we were talking closely with them because we wanted to try to make sure that our rules and their standards would be harmonized. There were also discussions with the European Union and FREG, which is the standard setter that was developing standards to implement the CSRD, and then eventually California as well, all to try to drive harmonization. And even though it seems like we're in a pretty fragmented environment, where we are now is much better harmonized than we were a few years ago. And so companies have a much better sense of what to report. So that's my view of the sort of reporting landscape. As for the ESG controller, now that we're moving into a regulated reporting sphere, we're seeing the emergence of this role, I think, because companies realize, oh, I'm going to have to report this information in my financial filings. This is a lot of data and it can be hard to calculate all this data. And I do need to work cross-functionally within my organization. This feels a lot like financial information. And frequently, I think companies didn't really have people with the capacity to properly address the collection and reporting of that climate and other ESG data. And so this ESG controller role has emerged to fill that gap and act like a financial controller, but addressing ESG data.
So Cecilia, you're on the coalface here. Like you are the person responsible for sifting through this evolution. But I wanted to, just as a starting point, I wanted to ask kind of what's your approach to sustainability reporting? Like, how does the company view it? What kind of reports are you putting out now? And what does it look like for you?
Yeah, so for me, my role right now is very much focused on using good data today so that we can bring together internal and external stakeholder groups to envision what the future is going to look like for us. And so as a global company, of course, we're tracking the landscape of the regulatory environment on ESG. That's the starting point. And as more global regulations are coming in line, we're seeing more complexity. We talked about that. But we're also seeing that, the synergy and the types of data being requested, both from a regulatory standpoint, but also, the point being that if we're reporting and everyone else is reporting, our customers were being asked for regulatory data, but also, for for data that's voluntary, right? There's still the voluntary requirements for data that are floating out there that align to goals that go above and beyond the regulatory schemes. And so what I'm seeing is like the request, the burden of the individual data points seems to be more consolidated as the regulations start to replicate more like for like. And I think this is really helping to drive consistency and in turn, I hope better data quality over time. But, I think, we're like most companies with a global footprint, we need to comply with CSRD. I mean, we're really focused on that being the big thing that we're looking toward. And we depend on the rigor of a double materiality assessment to help us define the risks and opportunities in that ESG space, as it maps to CSRD.
Are you finding this, either the CSRD or the consolidation that you're seeing, are you finding it helpful, like to drive these kinds of, better data collection processes that you need, or is it just kind of more burden?
I think it's helpful. I mean, I think shared definitions help because they means that not only are we tracking things like for like internally, but also it's meaningful in that broader context to get to the ultimate, goal and trying to improve climate outcomes or outcomes for people and for planet. So, this consistency is critical in my opinion, and having that coalescing component of having the data come from one source point is really helpful in my opinion.
And one last question before I go back to Christina. Does anything get left off the table when we go to these kind of standardized disclosures? Like, you're now being asked, for example, to go through this double materiality process. You're setting thresholds for what is material, and then you disclose on them. Those topic areas that maybe, are important internally, like they're valuable to Revlon, but don't meet this kind of standardized definition of materiality. Are those things being left out now in any way? Do they just get put to a different kind of place within the company, or is that it's just not a thing? Like, it's all good.
I think that the iterative process of this, right, is important. I want to say that we don't know what we don't know in some ways. Like, I think as we're developing the rigor and the data is coming through, we're going to see where those spaces are. Like, we're going to be able to articulate better where those spaces are. Reporting for CSRD hasn't turned on yet for many global companies. And I think over the next couple of years, what's being left off the table is going to become clear. But at the moment, I don't have an answer for you that can itemize what those things are, but I would expect absolutely for us to be able to see those in better clarity.
So I want to come back to you in a little bit about the process of double materiality. I know lots of people are kind of starting the process. There's all kinds of questions. See if we can tackle some of them. But before I do it, I wanted to ask Christina, within these various regulations, the CSRD, the SEC rule, California, etc., what are kind of the similarities that you can point to, like that if a company does something, it kind of applies across the board, and where are the key differences that companies should be aware of between them?
Yeah, so we've really sort of started with climate, meaning the SEC started with a climate disclosure rule. California's adopted these laws related to climate. The ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, started with a general disclosure standard, and then a climate standard, and it will move on to address other issues beyond climate. So human rights, biodiversity, many other issues, but it's going to sequentially move on to those. And then the CSRD is very, very broad. It covers, a whole host of topics. So as to climate, there is a common lane of travel, being measuring your greenhouse gas emissions in accordance with the greenhouse gas protocol. That's the thing that defines scope 1, 2, and 3 greenhouse gas emissions. It's sort of a common language for translating activities that a company engages in into carbon emissions in a singular unit of measure, which is carbon dioxide equivalent, and then the TCFD, which I talked about earlier. And that is a common lane of travel. The difference is you'll find largely in scope of coverage, and then importantly in the materiality lens that you apply. And what I mean by that is, for everyone other than the CSRD in Europe, we apply a single materiality lens. We're really focused on the investor and the information that's financially material to the company, financially important to investors. And that's the focus that the ISSB takes. And the ISSB, just to frame it, that's this International Sustainability Standards Board. It's being considered by some 20 plus countries around the world that make up more than 50% of global GDP. So it's going to be a very important standard that will be embedded within the rules of many countries. That applies a single materiality standard. So does California. Well, California doesn't apply materiality standards. The SEC applies a single materiality standard. So all of those are looking at the financial materiality of the information. The CSRD in Europe, much broader, applies this double materiality lens that looks not just at what's financially material, but also the material impacts that a company has on society. So that's one thing. Scope of coverage, everybody else covers basically climate at the moment, but Europe is addressing this whole broad range of issues. And then it's sort of a Venn diagram in terms of the companies that are covered. So Europe covers some 50,000 companies that are doing business in Europe. They may be based outside of Europe, but they have operations in Europe. The SEC rule applies to public companies in the US markets. California has a different framing that applies to US companies doing business in California and that meet certain revenue thresholds. And then the ISSB will be applied by different countries in accordance with what they define as the scope of their coverage. So a lot of this is still playing out. There is a common lane of travel substantively around climate, but there also are differences. And so we end up with sort of a jigsaw puzzle that we have to kind of piece together. And the pieces do come together, but maybe not always 100% perfectly.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a question in the chat, and I think it's a good lead in to what I want to talk about next. The question is, the role of investors in these regulations is clear and strong, but what do consumer preferences, for example, play? And in the regulation, there is this process of materiality that's required. We have to consider, we have to come up with criteria for how to determine what is material. And I know one of the requirements is that we consider stakeholder voices across the range, right? All stakeholders, what they consider to be material would influence on how we determine what is a material topic to us. So that could include, for example, consumer voice. So I want to shift to the process. I want to talk a little bit about what is the process by which we determine materiality, whether it's double materiality under the CSRD or climate risk, financial risk materiality under the SEC or California rules. And Cece, if maybe I can start with you. Can you just give us, I know these things might be private or confidential, so don't go anywhere that is. But can you give us kind of a snapshot of what the materiality process looks like for Revlon?
Yeah, and thanks for that little disclaimer. Yeah, we definitely won't go into any sort of confidential territory, but I think generally speaking, the application of the process is, we mentioned before the standardization using CSRD, and the methodology for double materiality assessments is well defined in that, the process for the methodology is well defined. You're seeing a lot of small, medium, and large firms getting involved in helping companies to move through the process of achieving a double materiality assessment, including, the big four. They're teaming tooling up and creating teams to be able to provide these services. But I think generally the process does take into account, the full landscape of risk, and specifically that gets articulated in what's called an IRO. So the impact, risks, and opportunities. And then there's a methodology that is applied to scoring each of those, the IROs. And that scoring system, again, is a specific methodology that has to be used in order to be compliant with CSRD, as an example. So what I think might be an interesting thing that I'm seeing from, in the last couple of months is trade associations are starting to do this for industries, which I actually think is quite helpful in terms of articulating industry level IROs, because your impact, risk, and opportunities can be idiosyncratic. They can be specific to your company, and some of them are industry wide and specific to the industry, and some of those are just, globally understood as risks for anybody in the market. And so what I think is interesting is that I've seen that starting to come online, I think, as a reaction to the CSRD preparation, is better articulation of the IROs at an industry level to help companies understand what that might look like for them. And so the process moves through that methodology. And as you mentioned, the stakeholder engagement is another part of the methodology is critical, is that you have multiple voices, both inside and outside the company, contributing to the assessment of the double materiality assessment. So in practice, it looks like a lot of, sort of workshops and large group discussions, and really, wrestling with how do you score within the methodology each of these IROs.
And the data that you collect as part of the materiality process. So you mentioned kind of workshops, discussions. Are you, and maybe Christina, you can chime in too. Is the data that we're collecting for this process, is it kind of interviews? Is it survey data? Is it benchmarking of peer companies and what they've decided is material? Is it the auditors or the consultant telling you what what information is relevant? What kind of data sets are you looking for as part of the process? Or all the above?
I was just gonna say, it's pretty much all of the above. I mean, it's sort of nesting data sets. Like you're going from the funnel down to understand and double click on specific things that might bring up questions of like, well, why do we think that? Let's explore that a little bit further. But you start from a general understanding in either workshops or surveys, and then do follow-ups and have, even individual conversations to just really understand why, how we're moving through the methodology. And Christina, maybe you can chime in too, because Persephone and its role in collecting and analyzing data, maybe you have another perspective on it.
Not really. I mean, I think you said it exactly right. There is this sort of nested process of you start broadly looking at all of the things that might be material and looking at a broad range of stakeholders, and then based on what I've seen, companies will sort of whittle down from there to hopefully come to the issues that really are important to the company, so that they're not boiling the ocean, which is, that boiling the ocean is not the intent. It's really, the intent is really to come to the issues that are important to the company and focus on those.
So Christina, this is the most unfair question I'm going to ask you, but here it comes. There's a threshold here, right? There's a threshold of materiality. So we've got 40 issues that we've evaluated, based on impact, based on financial materiality. And we, under the regulations, we have to say, here's a threshold above which we will report. The IFRS, the threshold is kind of tied to the reasonable investor and whether they would make a decision based on that. If we believe that they would, then it would be under the IFRS, we'd say that then goes on to the into the financial accounts, if I'm reading that correctly. The CSRD has vaguely similar, but also vaguely vague definitions of what is material on the impact or the financial side of the axes. What do you see, maybe from the Persephone perception, what do you see as, how are companies treating that threshold? Are they being really strict about it and saying, I'm only going to disclose on things that I think an investor would, really care about, and and whittle this down to 2 or 3 topic areas? Or are they being much more kind of lenient on what could possibly create a material risk or opportunity, more akin to the way we did voluntary sustainability reporting in the past, where I've got 30 to 40 issues to talk about? Where are you seeing the trend?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's early to say, to be honest with you, in that, the reporting is just emerging, as Cecilia was saying. Sort of hearing that there is a tendency for companies to identify more issues as material than might be ideal, and that some in the audit community, sort of feel as though that's perhaps a safer path because they don't want to miss something. But there's also been some commentary out of the EU that really wasn't the intent, that the intent is not for companies to produce multi-100-page reports that try to address every issue. They really do want you to think about the issues that may be material to your company or have impact materiality, and do that whittling process, to really identify those that are those issues that are significant for the company. But I think when we talk about this in say 3 years, when we have reports out to look at, I think we'll have a much better idea. But I might turn to Cecilia as well and see what she's seeing.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that's what, I can only speak from the perspective of a single company within the landscape, but I agree with what you're saying. Yeah, that it can be sort of overwhelming, especially at first glance. You're like, okay, how do we really set this threshold to be meaningful? Because in the end, right, like if you think outside of just the need to report, and you're thinking about what is the intention of the reporting exercise, it is to improve and have a positive impact. And so you've got to really focus on what you can do best and at scale to make an improvement.
I'll give you a little anecdote. During Climate Week, one of the meetings that I went to was a roundtable of chief sustainability officers from around the world. There were about 25 or so in there. And we did a quick comparison and discussion about this threshold question. And the exact numbers were, on the high end, one company had identified 27 material issues that they would be reporting on, and another company in the room was 3. And the conversation went to, what are the drivers for either being liberal or conservative about that threshold definition? So we talked about liability risks, either for over or under reporting, and there's a number of different data points that are coming onto the table to try to influence that decision on the threshold, all the way to, like, we're just looking at what other companies are doing, or we asked our auditor, like, what's a reasonable number? Is it 3 or 20? And the auditor, of course, is, I don't know. It looks like it's about 7. Like, there's all kinds of data points that are being shot across the bow of companies on how to whittle this down to a reasonable and defensible number. And it seems very much, I don't know, I'm not sure that everyone is convinced, to Christina's point, that we're going to come to a consensus around it. And so we get these risk managers that are saying either we shouldn't talk too much about it, we should be very conservative at first because it might play out that exposure is the real liability. And we get other risk managers saying, well, we should just we talked about it in the sustainability report, It would look really weird if we don't talk about it now, because we've always been using this term material. So we should probably stick with what we've already got out in the public domain, and the regulators might push for that. So it seems to be a bit, for all the standardization, we seem to still be in this Wild West just around that one question of what is the threshold.
Professor, I wanted to just kind of be mindful of time. We have probably about 10 minutes left, and so there's definitely some questions that are coming through in the Q&A. I think you all have the ability to see them. If you wanted, I can help lead some of those questions, or if you had some other topics that you wanted to hit upon, but I want to just be mindful of time.
Yeah, let's shift to the questions from the Q&A, because they might trigger more as well. So
if you have additional questions to post them, we'll try to get to as many as we can.
Oh, they continue to come. All right. Oh, and there's from some people that I recognize. All right, first one up. Let's see. What would you recommend for companies not yet public to start the evaluation process for impact funds, et cetera, as well as a potential IPO? This is for any one of us.
Maybe I'll take it first. The guidance that I've heard in multiple rooms on this topic is to start where you think you may end. And so if you think that that's your trajectory, start doing the work now. Don't wait. Get going. Start to understand what it is that you actually need to be assessing and how long it's going to take you to get there. And who needs to be involved. Like, start to get the governance in place to be able to do it right. Yeah, and the other thing, Christina, you might actually, I think it was in one of your panel discussions that I was attending, you were giving some good guidance on maybe the top two kind of starting points for evaluations, being GHG and maybe the TCFD, or thinking about climate risk assessment.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the TCFD is such a useful tool for any kind of risk. So it starts with climate, that's its origin, but we're seeing the TCFD baked into so many different regulatory frameworks. And I think that we're going to see the TCFD as an analytical tool that companies are using to think more broadly about their risk management and disclosures. So, I would get pretty comfortable with the TCFD, and that includes as one of its pillars governance. And of course, if you're starting out and you're thinking about IPOing, or you're thinking about where you want to go, evaluating your governance is always a good place to start. Do you have the right people in the room thinking about these issues? Is the board focused on these issues? How is management reporting up to the board? All of those questions are just foundational and super important, and they apply whether you're talking about cybersecurity or climate or human rights or whatever the issues are.
All right, the next question is from Lisa, who I know is deep in the weeds on this, and you can tell from her question that she's deep in the weeds. So she's asking about automation and last mile reporting technology solutions. There are a number of software services out there that are kind of trying to enter into the space, from kind of the big SAPs and Workivas to very niche software solutions. So she's asking about the cost benefit analysis of whether or not to invest in one of these technology solutions in support of your disclosure requirements. So why don't we start with the technology person? Christina, do you want to try? You want to throw your hat in there?
Yeah, I'm happy to. Although Cecilia is really a user of technology, so she may be less conflicted and have greater credibility. But I would think about a couple of things. One is what data you're trying to calculate. And I work for a carbon accounting software firm. We focus on carbon accounting. And the reason that I point that out is that carbon is different than other data because it has to be translated. You take companies' activities, whether it's airline miles flown or amount of electricity purchased or the stuff you buy, transporting that stuff, the manufacturing process, the disposal. You're looking at all those activities that you engage in, and you have to go through a translation process, which is what the greenhouse gas protocol is all about, in order to come up with carbon dioxide equivalent. And that process is really complicated. And so it lends itself very well to software. Other data points don't require translation. And so you might very well need to have a carbon accounting software tool to help you with that piece of it, and then perhaps plug that data into your general reporting system, whether it be Workiva or whatever. And then, also think about how hands-on you want to be and whether you want to have software that helps you to make use of the data, or whether you just kind of want a number to report, right? And I mean, we cater to customers that want to get their hands dirty and get into the data and have this constantly improving data that they can use over the long term to help them to meet their goals. So it's definitely not a, press a button and a number comes out for your report. It's, how do we get insights about our business and about our potential decarbonization strategy from the data? And we kind of support that. So we're like a heavier lift, both for the customer and the investment, than somebody who just wants a number but doesn't really want to manage their data. So think about what your goals are, why you want to procure software. So
yeah, I would just build on that just to say the question, you asked about factors, and I think what Christina is saying is exactly right. It's two things. One, what resources do you have? People resources and expertise on the team already. Time allocation, right? So how much capacity do you have on your team? And that kind of maps to the second factor, which is the maturity of your program, your ESG program or your sustainability program. I think those two things are really starting points in trying to understand the cost benefit analysis and how much more you might need to pick up, the runway between where you need to be for report readiness and where you're starting from.
So there's a number of other questions. I'm going to consolidate into, I think, two quick themes that capture most of them. So one theme is politics and regulation, or ESG regulation. Obviously a topic here in the United States, got an election coming up, very different takes on ESG disclosure between the parties. So quick tea leaf reading, what happens, how is politics going to influence these disclosure regulations going forward?
I mean, I think that, obviously if the Democrats win, that's gonna put some wind at the back of those who are working on sustainability, and there will be some headwinds if the Republicans win. But at the end of the day, we've made so much progress, and not to mix metaphors, but it's sort of like the train has left the station, and even if a Republican is in office, companies are still going to have to report pursuant to the California laws, pursuant to CSRD, pursuant to the ISSB in the various countries that are adopting regulations under the ISSB, and also pursuant to just stakeholder pressure, their customers, commercial customers, and retail customers. So and the whole range of other stakeholders. So I don't think there's any turning this thing back. Not to say it's irrelevant, but it's not going to have. It's not like a binary thing where all of a sudden you turn off the spigot and there's no more ESG. This is happening.
And Cecilia, the last questions for you. There's a couple questions on kind of investors and how they use this information. What are you seeing anything from investors on how and whether they're using these new disclosure data to make decisions?
It's such a good question, such an important part of thinking about the equation, right? Like where the data is going in and where the data is flowing out. I don't have a strong take on that at the moment, to be honest with you. I'm going to think about that and come back maybe for another discussion. But I just want to acknowledge that it is it is a really important part of understanding how the data is being used. And Todd, I remember distinctly in your class talking about alpha and what, you know, how it's being used, what are the metrics that are being used to try and navigate what is meaningful in ESG metrics and ESG data. But I don't have a clear opinion or kind of take on this at the moment.
It's probably universal. All right, I'm going to hand over to Keith for the final question, but for my part, thank you both. Keith, over to you.
Thank you, everyone, for all of your time today. And I just had a question, bringing it back to the MBA for Executives program. If you were to give any advice to people considering this program, you know, especially from the impact it may have had on your career, what would you say to people that are considering doing an MBA for Executives program? Maybe Christina, we'll start with you and turn over to Cecilia.
Sure. I mean, it changed my life for sure, and I loved it, but I also was all in, meaning, you know, I did as much work as I could. I was very serious about it. You know, it wasn't easy, and it wasn't like a sort of, nothing was given to me. So I would say, you know, really evaluate it and make sure that you have the time and the commitment, and that you really want to do this and you're willing to invest in, you know, the time, and it can be the most rewarding thing that you do.
Yeah, definitely. I appreciate that. I talk to a lot of people and they're considering these programs, and it's always a question of balance. You know, for many people, for everyone, they're going to be working full time because that's one of the requirements of the program. For many, there's a very busy personal life that's going on, as well as for some, there's quite a lot of travel because it is an in-person program. And so a lot of things have to align for people to be successful. And I think that when you're in the program, you find that your classmates are just as serious as you. They're really doing this for, you know, a personal benefit, but they're really committed to it. So I appreciate that. What about you, Cecilia, for your advice? What would you give to people that are thinking about the program? One of my other questions was, what is your favorite class? And you kind of answered that already. From the sustainability side. Todd is
Yeah,
sitting here.
that's like asking what your favorite movie is. I was like, oh man, my favorite class. So I guess, so one of the things that I always come back to when I think about my experience there, and you know, we talked about it in the introduction, is the business and society. And for me, that translates to this balance between head and heart. And there was this moment when we had a guest CEO speaker, you know, she was a CEO of a previous CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company. And she asked us to think about, when we're considering what our purpose is in the world, start by asking the question of yourself, what breaks your heart? And then, you know, from there, think about what you're going to do to, you know, improve the condition of that reality. And so my advice, I guess, within the realm of sustainability, if your answer to that question is in the realm of sustainability, you're probably in one of two groups. You're either already working in sustainability, like I was when I came into the program. And in that case, I would say, you know, invest time in investigating the topics that you may not have been able to previously, that maybe aren't in your purview. And that might light the path that you wouldn't have otherwise considered. And then if you're not coming in with a sustainability background, you know, use it as a way to stay open and let the process reveal to you what purpose lies ahead. I think that's and also always do your reading before the classes. It's a Herculean task, but so worth it. That's my other takeaway.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Todd, do you want to have any last minute parting pieces of advice for students to be successful in the program, or anything like that, especially the impacts and sustainability area?
I'll echo what Cecilia said. Do your reading. Part of the reason is the reason people come here is because they want to pivot. They want to pivot within their own job, or they want to pivot to new opportunities and new thinking. And the reading is key because that is how we expand our horizons to think about a problem along multiple axes. I hope everyone here joins us, of course. But I actually for the moment, I just want to thank Christina and Cecilia for joining us. It's a pleasure to see you both all the time. And just so glad that you could join us.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, everyone. I did put in the email address for the admissions for emba.admissions@yale.edu. So if you have any questions about the admissions process, our round 1 application is coming to a close next week, and then we'll have 2 more rounds throughout the course of the year. So thank you all. I hope everyone enjoyed the talk. I certainly did, and we will see you all later.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.